As a translation teacher, I would be very interested to know how you introduce translation of political texts in translation studies.
I don't actually teach practical translation myself. I mean, we do at Manchester, but the courses that I teach are theoretical courses, and I have a number of sessions on translation as renarration, and these would be examples of how the entire process of translation is one of recasting a narrative in different terms, and that narration doesn't just happen in the kind of individual phrases and words of the text. It happens in a variety of ways. That's how I would introduce
it. I would like to go back to the first question. First, I would like to know, this kind of interventions, more or less obvious, are they more common in internally generated translations?
I imagine so, because I think the ones that come from outside are subsidized and sponsored to fit in within a particular pattern. And so the agenda is, they've already, by selecting the text to translate it, they've already decided what is right for that culture. They're not going to select a text that is against their own values, and therefore they're going to have to engage with it in some way. So I imagine so, but I haven't actually looked at any texts that are generated from outside. It would be interesting to look at them, to see how they dealt with it.
Yeah. And second, just to finish, do you think that the translator should assume an ethic position to, for example, even though they say themselves in footnotes or in the introduction, when they hide themselves in the text itself, they're saying, even though there are many changes, who is the translation know that, they say, no, this is the text, and we are not influencing. It's a lack of ethic. They should show it to the reader.
I'm very interested in issues of ethics, and actually I have recently produced a number of things on that. I co-edited an issue of the interpreter and translator trainer with Carol Meyer of Penn State University on ethics and how you incorporate it into the curriculum, and the second edition of, in other words, my course book has a whole chapter on ethics and morality. And the problem with ethics, which is not a problem, it's a problem we have to live with because we are human beings and we have to be ethical. The problem with ethics, it's not simple. It's not a question of is this ethical and is this unethical. The problem is that there are many different parties, not just in the context of translation, but in any kind of situation you come across as a human being. There are always many different parties involved, and their interests clash with each other. And so what is ethical depends on how we prioritize these different parties. So is it ethical just by being loyal to the author, treating their voice with, or treating them with dignity, respecting what it is they have to say, not appropriating them, or is it ethical to look at the larger picture and see the impact of that kind of book, that kind of translation on society at large? Or is it a responsibility for the reader that you are giving them what they need to know without coloring it in any way? There are lots of different elements, and you could make different arguments for each of them. And ultimately, and that's why we disagree often in life, that two people who are equally ethical and equally committed and equally responsible may disagree on what is the right thing to do. Not because they don't care or are unethical, but because they prioritize different parties or different issues. And in their view, this is the most ethical thing to do. So it's not that simple. It doesn't mean that anything is right and or wrong, but it just means that the ethics is much more complex than we sometimes assume it is. There may not be one single ethical answer to a given challenge in life or in translation.
Mona, I have a question which is more connected with your concept of renarration. but it's also, it runs parallel to political texts related to translation of religious texts.
Oh, yes.
Right? Where when texts are translated from one religion to another, where the sacred texts of one religion are translated into a different language and a different culture. Do you have any experience with this, with how this, is there a tongue-in-cheek kind of strategy working as well? Like, this is fiction, they think it's the truth. Right?
Yeah. No, I often think about this, and I don't think that religious texts would be treated in quite the same way. For a start, it's unlikely that you would import into target culture a religious text which is very much at odds with the values of that culture. For example, I wonder if, for example, any books that, not just religious, but about religion, any books that are dismissive of Islam or of Muslims that are religious in basis, not political in the sense that there are books that argue against Islam as a religion, not kind of the title, not Huntington, but argue directly with Islam against religion. I don't know whether those would be picked up and translated, I'm not sure. But what is interesting about religious texts from the point of view of renarration is that religious texts are canonical texts. They are texts that are very, very important in every culture, and they are the texts that practically all members of the culture get exposed to. And therefore they are often the site of renarration in ways that allow the renarrator to produce new personalities, new personas for people to inhabit. So, for example, recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, Turkey decided to, they call it rewriting, but it is translation because Turks read in Turkish, not in Arabic. But they decided to revise the sayings of the Prophet in Turkish, because they felt that they had to modernize and to make Turks more part of the modern world. And when you realize that Turkey is trying to join the EU, and one of the major issues there is that it's a Muslim country and Islam is on the rise and so on, what they're trying to do is use canonical texts like this to produce new persona for people to inhabit, to rethink what the text says, because translation always offers a new opportunity for interpretation, which is easier to deal with than trying to reinterpret the text in the same language. And so, and similarly, the translation of the Bible under apartheid, for instance, in 1933, 1953, 53 was a slight revision of the translation into Afrikaans of the Bible, which came out, the first translation, 1933, revised very slightly in 1953, produced at the time when the church was very supportive of the idea of apartheid and actually promoted the idea that the world was made up of different peoples and they were apart and so on. And then in 1983, which is 3 years before the church actually denounced apartheid formally and said that it no longer supported apartheid, they produced a new translation of the Bible. And if you look at the relatively minor changes made, they all add up to replacing references to peoples and nations and so on with believers and unbelievers. So the whole terminology was changed from saying that, for example, you do not let your sons marry their daughters, the daughters of other peoples, becomes the believers do not marry non-believers. So they're encouraging people to think of themselves as believers or non-believers, not as white or black or belonging to different ethnic groups. So I think the interesting thing about religious texts is that they are canonical, and the same thing happens, I think, with translations of texts like Shakespeare, for instance, which are studied in schools all over the world, and translation of children's literature because it's very formative. These kinds of texts are a site for elaborating for people personas that are more in tune with what is going on, what is being promoted as public narratives of the time, and making them think of themselves in different terms. So maybe something else is going on there.
So if nobody else wants to say, John.
Okay, just a couple of things. Those papers where people who want to go onto the trad info list were circulating. Could you give them back to me? And if anybody wants to go onto this trad info list to get messages about events connected to translation, not much, just 2 or 3 messages a day. Just put your names here on the sheet, and they should be circulating around here, so please give them back to me. CITRAT, Centro de Terminologia, Centro de Tradução e Terminologia, and the Department of Letras Modernas will be, has a series, this is one of the series of talks, lectures, which we are offering. The next one, the last for the semester, will take place on Friday afternoon of next week, the 10th of June. Professor Francis Olber will be giving it on his translations of the plays of Ibsen, directly from Norwegian, of course, into Portuguese. And I'd like to thank you all very much for your presence, and thanks to CITRAT as well. And thank you especially Mona for coming. She's on her way from Belo Horizonte to Florianopolis, and but she had to give the lecture.